Hey everyone, welcome to another video and welcome once again to DC. Today we're gonna walk from the White House to the Washington Monument, which, for those who don't know, is that famous obelisk that you can see in the distance. If you've never been here in DC, there's the White House. I'm gonna come closer so that you can see how it looks from the street. And before I start today's topic, I just wanna say that it's important if you like this video and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and please let me know your feedback, what you think. It's really important for me since I'm just starting. But alright, let's go to today's topic. I already went over how DC became the capital and my impressions of the city as a tourist. Today I decided to talk about the implications of Washington DC being a federal district. I want to explore what does it mean and how does it affect the lives of people living in the city. I'm going to start by saying that by definition, Washington DC is not a state. It's not even part of a state. Yes, there's a state called Washington as well, but it's on the other side of the country. I think many non-Americans usually gets those mistaken, the two Washingtons, but Washington DC, it's on the eastern part of the US, and the Washington state is on the western side, and they don't have anything to do with each other. So Washington DC is a federal district. It's a territory created specifically to host the capital of the United States. That distinction matters because Washington wasn't designed the way other American cities were. It wasn't meant to grow naturally inside a state or to represent local interests. From the beginning, it was created to serve a national function. The origins of the city go back to a concern that existed very early in US history. The fear that if the capital were located inside a single state, that state could gain disproportionate influence over the federal government. To avoid that, the founders decided the capital should sit on neutral ground, land that would not belong to any state, and therefore would not answer to any one of them. The idea was that the capital should belong to the entire country, not to a local population. Because of that, Washington was designed first and foremost to serve the federal government. Its institutions, its layout, and its legal status were all shaped around that purpose, long before the city became a place where hundreds of thousands of people would actually live their daily lives. So in other words, Washington was never really meant to be a city in the usual sense. It was meant to be a seat of power, a symbolic and administrative space, rather than a community with its own political identity. And that original decision, made more than 2 centuries ago, still shapes the city today. It affects how Washington is governed, how much power its residents have, and why debates around representation and statehood exist in the first place. To understand those debates, you first have to understand this fundamental tension. Washington was designed to belong to everyone, which also meant, in a very real way, that it didn't fully belong to the people who lived here. Once you understand why Washington was created as a federal district, you start to see a contradiction that still defines the city today. People who live here in DC live ordinary lives. They work, they raise families, they pay federal taxes, just like residents of any other city in the country. They also serve in the US military. Thousands of people from Washington have served in wars, deployments, and federal service, carrying the same obligations as citizens in any state. And yet, when it comes to political representation at the federal level, Washington is different. Residents of DC do not have full voting representation in Congress. They elect a delegate to the House of Representatives, but that delegate cannot vote on final legislation. And Washington has no voting representation in the Senate at all. This means that the people who live in the capital of the United States are subject to federal laws, federal taxes, and federal authority without having the same direct influence over those laws as citizens living in states. At the same time, Washington residents do vote for president, but that wasn't always the case. It only became possible in the early 60s, when a constitutional amendment granted Washington 3 electoral votes, the same number as the least populous states. That detail alone shows how unusual the city's status is. Washington participates in presidential elections, but remains excluded from full representation in the legislative body that actually writes the laws. The phrase often associated with this situation, no taxation without representation, is famously tied to the origins of the capital itself, as we explored in the first video. And yet, here it exists again, not as a revolutionary slogan, but as a quiet, unresolved reality embedded in real life. What I find most interesting about this isn't outrage or protest, it's how normalized it has become. That's part of what makes Washington feel so symbolic. The city represents democratic ideals at a national level, while the political rights of its own residents remain incomplete. Circling back to what we have discussed in the first video, the United States itself was founded around the conflict over political representation. Colonists argued that being subject to laws and taxes without having a meaningful voice in the body that imposed them was unacceptable. That idea became one of the moral foundations of the country. Walking through Washington today, it's hard not to notice the echo. The difference, of course, is that it isn't a revolutionary conflict. It isn't dramatic or explosive. It's institutionalized. It exists quietly, embedded in law, procedure, and routine. Residents of today's Washington aren't rebelling against authority. They are living inside a system that was designed long ago, under conditions that no longer exist, and that hasn't fully adapted to the reality of a modern city. By the way, sorry about the abrupt change of direction here. I was just trying to avoid the massive amount of children that were coming towards me. I just didn't want to film them. But anyway, as I was saying, that lack of adaptability to the reality of a modern city, that's part of why the contradictions doesn't feel urgent in daily life. It's present in the fact that decisions affecting the city can be made by people who don't live here. What's unusual isn't that the contradiction exists. Many political systems contain inconsistency. What's unusual is how long it has persisted and how normalized it has become. Over time, the issue stops feeling like a crisis and starts feeling like a condition, something inherited rather than chosen. And that's where Washington stands today. Not at the center of a rebellion, but at the center of a question that the country hasn't fully answered. How to reconcile a capital designed for neutrality with a population that has grown into a permanent political community. Beyond representation in Congress, Washington's status as a federal district shapes how the city is governed in much more practical ways. Unlike other American cities, D.C. ultimately falls under the authority of Congress. That means the same legislative body that governs the country also holds the power to review, modify, or overturn laws passed by the city's local government. Washington does have a mayor and a city council. Local elections take place, budgets are proposed, and the city laws are passed, much like in any other large American city. But that autonomy has limits. Congress retains oversight authority, including the power to intervene in local legislation and financial decisions. In practice, this means the city governs itself, but not finally. There's also something structurally unusual about how Washington functions day to day. The city performs roles that, elsewhere in the US, are divided among different layers of government. Washington operates simultaneously as a city, a county, and in many aspects, a state. That concentration of responsibilities creates efficiency but also reinforces the sense that Washington is an exception to the normal rules. It doesn't fully fit into the standard federal system. So while Washington feels like a city in everyday life, with neighborhoods, schools, and routines, it operates under a framework that constantly reminds you that it isn't fully sovereign. One of the things you'll notice very quickly while walking through Washington is that there are no skyscrapers, no towers dominating the skyline, no buildings competing for attention by sheer height. That's not an accident. Washington has strict height limits that prevent most buildings from rising above a certain scale. The result is that monuments, and not offices, not corporations and private developments, dominate the horizon. As you walk through the city, the US Capitol, the Washington Monument, and other federal landmarks remain visually present no matter where you are. as you can see in this video as well. Nothing is allowed to overshadow them. And what's interesting is how this shapes your experience of power. In many cities, power feels vertical, expressed through height, density, and dominance over the street. You look up and the city towers above you. In Washington, power works differently. Here, it's spread out. It's horizontal, just like a democracy with its usual 3 branches of power. You don't feel small because something looms over you. You feel surrounded by symbols that are always within sight. While walking, this creates a very particular psychological effect. The city doesn't overwhelm you with scale, but it never lets you forget where you are because power is always visible. The skyline itself reinforces the idea that institutions and not individuals sit at the top. This makes Washington feel calm and even quiet at times, but it's not empty, it's intentional. The absence of vertical dominance is part of how authority is expressed here. There's another feature of Washington that feels unusual once you stop and think about it. The most central, visible, and valuable land in DC doesn't produce money, which, as we all know, is the fuel of the capitalist world. The National Mall sits at the very heart of the city. It's prime land by every possible measure. There's a central location, global visibility, historical importance, and yet there's no housing there. No office buildings, no commercial development. In most cities around the world, that kind of space would be unimaginable. City centers are usually where land is monetized most aggressively through finance, business, tourism, or real estate. Washington does the opposite. The space here is reserved for monuments, museums, open lawns, and long sightlines. It's designed for movement, gathering, and symbolism, not productivity or profit. That choice says a lot about priorities. It suggests that, at least in the capital, the representation of national identity is valued more than economic efficiency. Another interesting thing about Washington is how it's designed with wide avenues, large plazas, open lawns, and long sightlines allow people to gather in visible ways. Demonstrations don't need to squeeze themselves into corners, they unfold in the open, often in front of the institutions they are addressing. It ended up being a place that's designed to absorb protests. After all, it's the center of, at least in theory, a democracy. And I say in theory because the way I see it, we don't really live in a true democracy. I mean, we have billionaires like Elon Musk working inside the government. I mean, thankfully he doesn't work anymore, but he used to in the beginning of the Trump government. But that's when you realize that true democracy doesn't exist. It's just money running over everything. And this is something that we can perhaps explore in another video. But anyway, over time, dissent has become part of Washington's identity. The city isn't only a place where laws are written, it's a place where those laws are questioned, challenged, and publicly confronted. Some of the most significant demonstrations in the history of the US have taken place here. Massive protests against the Vietnam War filled the National Mall for years. The civil rights movement brought hundreds of thousands of people to Washington, including the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered one of the most influential speeches in the history of the country. More recently, Washington has continued to serve as a focal point for protests related to war, civil rights, climate, and political accountability. The issues change, but the location remains the same. In that sense, protest isn't a disruption of Washington's purpose. It's one of the ways the city fulfills it. What I'm trying to say here while talking about the city's height limits, land use, and civic movement is that DC, being the capital, differs itself from any other large American city because of its own political nature. And that brings contradictions to the regular people who live here. Limited representation, federal oversight, symbolic space. Eventually, this led to one central question. What political future should Washington have? For decades now, the question has taken a very specific form: statehood. In 2016, residents of Washington D.C. voted in a local referendum on whether the district should become a state. Roughly 86% of voters supported the idea. That vote didn't change Washington's legal status, but it made something very clear. A large majority of the people who live here believe the current arrangement no longer makes sense. One of the reasons for that is how Washington already functions in practice. Despite not being a state, the district is treated as one in more than 500 federal laws. It operates its own public school system, manages programs like Medicaid and SNAP, and receives federal block grants that are typically awarded to states. In other words, Washington already carries many of the responsibilities of statehood without the corresponding political authority. As I said in the beginning, district residents fulfill all the standard obligations of US citizenship. Still, they lack full voting representation in Congress, and Congress retains the power to override local laws passed by the city's elected government. There are also limits that don't exist in any other state. Washington does not control its own National Guard, which answers directly to the president. The district has no senators, no voting members of the House, and no role in confirming federal judges, even though those judges exercise authority over people who live here. Taken together, this is why supporters of statehood argue that Washington exists in a kind of permanent political exception, carrying responsibilities without sovereignty. In recent years, statehood proposals have taken a more concrete form in Congress. Legislation has been introduced in both the House and the Senate that would admit most of Washington as a new state, while preserving a small federal district around the core institutions of government. Under those proposals, a reduced federal area, including places like the White House, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, and the National Mall, would remain the official seat of the federal government, as required by the Constitution. The rest of the city, the residential and commercial areas where people actually live, would become a new state, sometimes referred in proposals as Douglas Commonwealth, in reference to Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist. And that would allow them to keep the abbreviation DC. They would be able to, instead of use District of Columbia, to use Douglas Commonwealth. Where this effort stands today is less about local will than national politics. Statehood legislation has been introduced multiple times and passed the House, but it has not advanced through the full legislative process. Becoming a state would require approval by Congress and the President, a threshold Washington has not yet crossed. What makes the statehood movement significant isn't just the political outcome, it's what the debate reveals. A city built to represent democracy is still negotiating how fully its own residents are allowed to participate in it. And that unresolved tension continues to shape Washington, not as an abstract capital, but as a place where people live ordinary lives inside an extraordinary political exception. If the case for statehood seems on the surface fairly straightforward, equal rights, equal representation, the question then becomes, why hasn't it happened? The answer is that opposition to Washington becoming a state is political, symbolic, and deeply ideological. While searching the arguments against statehood, I came across justifications claiming that reducing the size of the federal district would create chaos with its currency votes for president, because it would be a federal district with almost no permanent residents still participating in presidential elections. If you remember, they have received the rights to vote for president, so one of the questions that arises is how would that work? But that, along with other technical issues, could force constitutional amendments. Also, Walter Washington, the district's first elected home rule mayor, warned that converting Washington into a state while carving out a separate federal enclave could, in his words, erode the very fabric of the city itself and the viability of the city. But then, after looking a little deeper in it, I finally understood why statehood is still very debated. The major concern often raised is the shift in political power that statehood would bring. Based on recent voting patterns, Washington would likely become one of the most politically uniform states in the country. It would be the only state with no Republican elected officials anywhere in the state government. And that reflects the fact that Republicans went against the proposition in the past because admitting D.C. as a state would permanently alter the balance of representation in Congress. And all of this made me understand that, in the end, this conflict is about identity, power, and the uneasy relationship between democracy as an ideal and democracy as a lived reality. Washington, as I see it, feels like a city suspended between what it represents and what it allows its residents to be.